She said it like it was nothing, like it was just another fact about herself, no different than her eye color or where she was born. "I've never had a birthday party," the elderly woman told the biker standing on her porch, her voice steady but hollow. "Not once in my entire life." The biker, a man whose leather vest bore patches that made grown men cross the street, felt something crack inside his chest. He'd seen violence. He'd buried brothers. He'd lived through things most people only see in movies. But this quiet confession from a woman the world had forgotten, this was different. Because less than a year later, the ground outside her house would begin to shake. The sound would start low, barely audible, then grow into a thunder that would make windows rattle and hearts race. What rolled down that quiet suburban street wasn't a threat. It was a reckoning. It was 43 members of one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in America, arriving to prove that family isn't about blood and loyalty isn't reserved for the young or the powerful. This is the story of how one forgotten woman's birthday became the day an entire town learned what brotherhood really means. Eleanor Whitmore had become a ghost in her own neighborhood. At 67, she moved through life like background noise, present but never really seen, heard but never truly listened to. Her house sat at the end of Maple Street, a small brick structure with faded blue shutters and a garden that had long since surrendered to weeds. The mailbox at the end of her driveway leaned slightly to the left, damaged years ago by a careless snowplow and never repaired. The paint on her front door had begun to peel, revealing layers of previous colors beneath, evidence of better days, of times when someone cared enough to maintain these details. Inside, the silence was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. No television laughter, no phone conversations, just the hum of an old refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards beneath her careful steps. The house still held remnants of the life she'd shared with Richard, his reading glasses on the bookshelf, still sitting where he'd left them 12 years ago, his favorite coffee mug in the cabinet, never used but never put away, photographs covering the walls showing younger versions of themselves, frozen in moments of joy that now felt like they'd happened to different people entirely. She'd been widowed for 12 years. Her husband, Richard, had been her entire world, and when he died, suddenly, a heart attack while mowing the lawn on a Saturday afternoon, that world collapsed inward until it was just her, for walls, and memories that grew dimmer each passing year. They'd never had children. It wasn't by choice exactly, just one of those things that never happened. First they were building careers, then saving for a house. Then there were health complications, and by the time they might have reconsidered, it was too late. They'd told themselves they were enough for each other, and for a long time, they had been. The neighbors she'd known for decades had either moved away or stopped waving back. The Hendersons next door had relocated to Florida 3 years ago. The young couple across the street didn't even know her name. New families came and went, their lives too busy, too full, to notice the elderly woman who still took out her trash every Tuesday morning at exactly 7 o'clock and retrieved her mail every afternoon at 3 o'clock sharp. Her routine's the only structure left in an otherwise shapeless existence. Birthdays had always been quiet. Even as a child, Eleanor's family hadn't been the celebrating type. Her parents, immigrants who'd survived the Depression, believed in practicality over sentiment, work over play. A birthday meant you were another year older, another year closer to being a productive member of society. There were no balloons, no presents wrapped in colorful paper, no friends gathered around a table singing off-key. As an adult, Richard would take her to dinner sometimes, a small Italian place called Angelo's that they both loved, where the owner knew their order by heart. But never anything elaborate. Never cake with candles. Never that moment where people sang and you felt, even for just a few seconds, like you mattered to someone. Richard wasn't unloving. Far from it. But he'd grown up in a similar household, where affection was shown through steady presence rather than grand gestures. After he died, Birthdays became just another day circled on a calendar she barely looked at anymore. She'd wake up, make her coffee in the same chipped mug. Ironically, a gift from Richard that read, "World's Best Wife." Sit in the same chair by the window, and watch the world move past her like she was already gone. Sometimes she'd make herself a small cupcake from a boxed mix, stick a single candle in it, and blow it out alone in her kitchen. But even that tradition had faded after a few years. What was the point of celebrating alone? The loneliness wasn't sharp anymore. It had dulled into something she'd learned to carry, the way you carry an old injury that only aches when the weather changes. She told herself it was fine. She told herself she didn't need anything different. She told herself these things so often she almost believed them. Almost. Because late at night, when sleep wouldn't come and the house felt particularly empty, she'd lie in bed and wonder what it would be like, just once, to have people gather for her. To feel like her existence had made enough of an impact that people would stop their busy lives to acknowledge it. Caleb Stone wasn't the kind of man people approached casually. At 52, his face carried the map of a hard life. Lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth from decades of squinting into the sun on long rides. A scar running along his left jawline from a bar fight he barely remembered. His hands were calloused and scarred, his knuckles permanently swollen from decades of gripping handlebars and, when necessary, defending his brothers. The leather vest he wore wasn't fashion. It was identity, armor, history. Each patch told a story, marked a moment, represented a bond that went deeper than most marriages. The large patch on his back identified his club. The smaller ones memorialized brothers who'd fallen, and the worn edges of the leather itself testified to thousands of miles, countless rallies, and a life spent choosing the road over stability. He'd been riding with the club for 30 years, since he was 22 and angry at a world that had already decided he wasn't worth much. His father had been a drunk who'd left when Caleb was 8. His mother had worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. He'd dropped out of high school, drifted through dead-end jobs, and was heading nowhere fast when he met Ghost at a garage where they both worked. Ghost had introduced him to the club, and it had saved his life. Gave him purpose, structure, a family of men who'd walk through fire for him without hesitation. He'd been riding long enough to have buried more brothers than he cared to count, some to accidents, some to violence, some to the slower deaths of addiction and despair. Long enough to understand that the world outside saw them as criminals, thugs, a threat to decent society. They weren't wrong about everything. The club had its rules, its codes, and yes, sometimes those codes put them on the wrong side of the law. But what outsiders never understood was the loyalty, the brotherhood, the way these men would ride through hell for each other without hesitation, without question, without expecting anything in return except the same fierce devotion when their own time came. Caleb had pulled up to Eleanor's house on a cold Tuesday afternoon in February, his motorcycle rumbling low as he killed the engine in her driveway. He wasn't there for club business. He was there because his mother, who lived 3 streets over, had asked him to check on the lonely woman at the end of Maple, who she'd heard from her church group hadn't been feeling well. His mother, Maria, had a gift for noticing people others missed, for seeing those society had already written off. Caleb knocked 3 times, firm but not aggressive, and waited. Through the door, he could hear shuffling footsteps, cautious and slow. When Eleanor opened the door, she looked startled, maybe even frightened. He couldn't blame her. A 6'2" biker in full colors showing up unannounced wasn't exactly comforting. "Ma'am, I'm Caleb. My mother lives over on Oak Street, Maria Stone, and she asked me to check in, make sure you're doing all right." He kept his voice gentle, his hands visible, his body language as non-threatening as a man his size could manage. Eleanor's fears softened into confusion, then something like gratitude. "Your mother?" "Yes, I know Maria from church. Or I did, anyway. I haven't been in a while." She opened the door a bit wider. "That's very kind of her to think of me. They talked for 20 minutes on her porch, nothing deep at first, just small talk about the neighborhood, the weather, her garden that needed attention. Caleb offered to help with the heavy work, moving some rocks, maybe clearing the overgrown flower beds, and Eleanor accepted with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Then, as he was about to leave, he asked about her birthday, mentioning that his mother had said it was coming up soon, sometime in the fall, she'd thought. Eleanor smiled, but it was a sad smile, empty around the edges. Oh yes, November. But I've never really celebrated. Never had a birthday party, actually. Not once in my entire life. She said it so casually, like she was commenting on never having tried sushi or never having been to Europe. Like it was just one more unremarkable detail in an unremarkable life. But Caleb heard something else in her voice. Not self-pity, not even sadness exactly, just acceptance, resignation. The sound of someone who'd been overlooked so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. He stood there for a moment, not saying anything, because he didn't trust his voice. Something about those words, delivered so matter-of-factly, hit him harder than any punch he'd ever taken. This woman had lived 67 years on this planet, and not once had anyone thrown her a party. Had anyone gathered to celebrate her existence? Had anyone made her feel like her birth was worth acknowledging? Before he left, he made her a promise. Your next birthday is going to be different. I guarantee it. She laughed it off, told him not to worry, told him she was used to it. But Caleb Stone wasn't a man who made promises lightly, and when he did, he kept them. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next proves that sometimes the most powerful moments in life come from the most unexpected places, from the people society teaches us to fear rather than trust. That night, Caleb sat in the back room of the clubhouse, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town that smelled like motor oil, leather, and decades of cigarette smoke. The walls were covered with photographs, group shots from rallies dating back to the 70s, memorial photos of brothers who'd passed, candid moments that captured the essence of what they were, a family bound by choice rather than blood. 15 of his brothers were there, men with names like Reaper, Ghost, Bull, and Tank. Names that sounded threatening until you understood they were armor, protection against a world that had already decided who they were before giving them a chance to prove otherwise. Reaper, whose real name was Marcus, taught kindergarten when he wasn't writing. Ghost had grown up as one of the only Asian kids in his neighborhood, constantly told he didn't belong. Bull had raised 3 daughters as a single father. Tank, the most intimidating of them all, cried at movies and had lost his wife young. Caleb told them about Eleanor, about her quiet house and quieter life, about a lifetime without a single birthday party, about the way she'd said it, like it was normal, like being overlooked was just part of being her, about the garden full of weeds that testified to years of slow surrender. The room went silent. These weren't men who showed emotion easily. They'd learned young that vulnerability was dangerous, that softness got you hurt. But something about Eleanor's story cut through their hardened exterior. Maybe because most of them knew what it felt like to be written off, to be judged before you ever opened your mouth. Maybe because they'd all lost people they loved and knew how easy it was to slip through the cracks when you didn't have someone fighting to keep you visible. So what are you thinking? Ghost asked, his voice rough from years of smoking. Caleb looked around the room at these men, his family, the only people in the world he trusted completely. I'm thinking we throw her a birthday party. A real one. The kind she's never had. The kind she deserves. The kind of silence that followed wasn't doubt. It was calculation. Planning. The gears of Brotherhood turning in unison. Bull, the club's road captain, a man who'd been riding since before some of these guys were born, leaned forward. His massive hands drummed thoughtfully on the table. We do this right, we do it big. If we're going to make this woman feel seen, we make damn sure she knows it. We make it something she'll remember for whatever time she has left. And so the planning began. Over the next 8 months, they'd reach out to other chapters, other clubs they had alliances with. They'd coordinate schedules, arrange for decorations, order a custom cake. They'd keep it quiet, checking in on Eleanor periodically through Caleb's mother to make sure she was all right, but never letting on what was coming. By early November, everything was in place. 43 riders from 3 counties had committed to being there. They'd show this town that Eleanor Whitmore mattered, that she wasn't invisible, that her life deserved to be celebrated. Eleanor woke up on her 68th birthday the same way she'd woken up on every birthday before it. Alone. The morning light filtered through her thin curtains the same way it always did, casting familiar shadows across furniture that hadn't moved in years. She made her coffee in the same chipped mug she'd been using for 15 years, the one with the faded flowers that had survived countless washings. She took it to the same chair by the window, watching early commuters back out of driveways, rushing to jobs and appointments and lives that seemed impossibly busy from her stationary position. She thought about Caleb's visit all those months ago, about his promise that this birthday would be different. She'd appreciated the kindness, but she knew better than to expect anything. People said things. People meant well. But life had taught her that good intentions rarely survived contact with real life. It was fine. She'd made her peace with it. 67 birthdays without a party meant 68 wouldn't be any different. The pattern was set. The morning passed slowly. She did her crossword puzzle, the same daily puzzle she'd been doing for 30 years. She watched some television without really paying attention, a morning talk show where beautiful people discussed problems that seemed trivial from her vantage point. She made herself a sandwich for lunch and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, because sitting at the table alone felt too formal, too much like admitting she was waiting for something that would never come. Around 2 o'clock, she heard it. At first, she thought it was thunder, a low, distant rumble that made the windows hum slightly in their frames. But the sky was clear, not a cloud visible, and the sound wasn't fading. It was growing, getting closer, louder, building from a distant rumble into something that made her walls vibrate. Eleanor stood up, confusion replacing her usual resignation. Her heart began to beat faster. She walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain with a trembling hand, and what she saw made her heart stop. Motorcycles, dozens of them, rolling slowly down Maple Street in perfect formation, their engines creating a symphony of controlled power that shook the ground beneath her house. The sound was overwhelming now, filling every space, impossible to ignore. At the front was Caleb, his face serious but his eyes warm when they found her window, and behind him stretched a line of riders that seemed endless. They just kept coming, bike after bike after bike, each one wearing leather and patches. They pulled up to her house, lining both sides of the street, filling every available space. Some had to park in neighboring driveways. Others pulled onto lawns. The street was completely blocked, a wall of chrome and leather and humanity. The engines cut off one by one, and in the sudden silence that followed, a silence somehow louder than the noise that preceded it, Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She couldn't move, couldn't process what she was seeing, couldn't understand why this was happening. Her mind scrambled for explanations. Wrong address? Some kind of mistake. Caleb dismounted first, his movements deliberate and unhurried, giving her time to adjust. Behind him, the other riders followed, but they kept their distance, respectful, giving her space, forming a loose semicircle. Many were carrying things, bags, boxes, decorations. One was carefully balancing a massive cake box. When Eleanor finally opened her door, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the knob. She stepped onto her porch in her house slippers and cardigan. "What is this?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Caleb smiled, and it transformed his entire face, softened every hard edge. "This is your birthday party, Eleanor. The one you should have had 67 times before now." She looked past him at the sea of leather and motorcycles, at faces that ranged from young to ancient, at men and women she'd never met who'd apparently driven hours to be here, and something inside her chest cracked open. Not broke. Cracked open like a seed that had been waiting years for the right conditions to finally grow. I don't understand. Tears were already streaming down her face. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. Ghost stepped forward, his massive frame somehow gentle in his approach. That's exactly why, ma'am. Because you deserve people to know you. You deserve to be celebrated. And if your family and neighbors didn't do it, then your new family will. The next 2 hours were the most surreal of Eleanor's life. They'd brought everything. A massive 3-tier cake from the best bakery in town, covered in delicate frosting flowers and decorated with 68 candles. Caleb had counted carefully. Decorations that transformed her dull, weed-choked front yard into something magical. Banners and balloons and streamers in bright colors. Food enough to feed a small army. Trays of sandwiches, bowls of salad, a whole table dedicated to desserts. But more than the material things, they brought presents. They brought attention. They brought the one thing Eleanor hadn't felt in decades, the absolute certainty that she mattered to someone. They brought a custom banner that read, "Happy 68th Birthday, Eleanor," in letters 3 feet high. They'd brought a photo booth area with props, and they insisted on taking pictures with her, genuine smiles, arms around her shoulders, treating her like family. Neighbors came out of their houses, initially alarmed by the noise and the crowd. Mrs. Chun from 2 doors down called 911 before even coming outside. The Johnsons across the street stood on their porch with arms crossed, suspicious. But then curious turned to understanding as they saw the cake, the decorations, the elderly woman in the center crying happy tears. Then understanding turned to shame as they realized they'd lived on this street for years, some of them decades, and had never once thought to check on her. Some brought gifts, suddenly ashamed. Mrs. Chun returned with homemade cookies, apologizing for calling the police. The Johnsons brought flowers from their garden. The police showed up, 2 squad cars with lights, but no sirens. Officers Morrison and Patel, who'd patrolled this neighborhood for years, quickly assessed the situation. When they saw what was actually happening, not a threat, but an act of profound kindness, they stayed to help, directing traffic and making sure everything stayed peaceful. Morrison even ended up cutting the cake later, laughing with Tank about their shared love of fishing. Local news caught wind and sent a crew. The footage would go viral within hours. An elderly woman in tears, surrounded by dozens of bikers singing happy birthday, her face glowing with a joy so pure it made viewers around the world cry into their phones. But the moment that broke Eleanor completely came when Tank, the club's sergeant-at-arms, a man covered in tattoos with a reputation that made hardened criminals nervous, knelt beside her chair and presented her with a custom leather vest. It was beautiful, soft leather, perfectly sized to her small frame. It had her name stitched on the front in elegant script, Eleanor Whitmore. On the back, in bold letters, honorary member. Never forgotten. Always family. You're one of us now, Tank said, his gruff voice catching slightly. That means if you ever need anything, day or night, you call. We show up. That's what family does. That's what we do for each other. And now we do it for you too. Eleanor held that vest like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever owned. Because it was. It wasn't just leather and patches, it was belonging. It was proof that she mattered. She clutched it to her chest and sobbed, decades of loneliness pouring out while 43 bikers stood witness. When they asked her to make a wish and blow out the candles, Eleanor closed her eyes. She didn't wish for health or money or any of the practical things she probably should have wished for. She wished that every person who felt overlooked, every person who'd been forgotten, every person who'd given up on matching could feel what she felt right now. When she opened her eyes and blew out those 68 candles, it took 3 tries, but Ghost and Reaper helped with the last stubborn ones. 43 bikers erupted in cheers so loud the sound carried across half the town. As the sun began to set and the party wound down, Caleb sat with Eleanor on her porch steps. The other riders were packing up, but slowly, reluctant to let the moment end. Eleanor was still wearing her vest, had insisted on it, and kept running her hands over the patches. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough," Eleanor said quietly, her voice hoarse from hours of talking and laughing and crying. "For what you've given me today. For reminding me what it feels like to be seen." Caleb shook his head. "You've got it backward. You reminded us why we do this. Why we built this brotherhood in the first place. It's not about the bikes or the patches or the reputation. It's about showing up for people when the rest of the world is checked out. It's about being the family people need when their own family isn't there." Eleanor reached over and squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I spent 67 years thinking I didn't matter, that my life was too small, too quiet, too forgettable to make any difference. But today you showed me that isn't true. That even one life, even one overlooked birthday, matters enough for 43 people to ride across 3 counties to celebrate it." She paused, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, the belief that I'm worth remembering." Over the following weeks, Eleanor's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The bikers didn't just throw her a party and disappear. They kept showing up. Caleb stopped by twice a week to check on her, sometimes bringing his mother, sometimes coming alone just to sit and talk. Ghost helped her fix the broken fence in her backyard, refusing to let her pay him. He brought his tools and spent a Saturday working. And when Eleanor brought him lemonade, they sat in her garden for hours talking about his childhood, about how the club had been the first place he'd felt like he truly belonged. Tank and his wife invited her to Sunday dinners, introducing her to their kids who started calling her Grandma Eleanor. Other club members rotated through, making sure she had groceries, that her house was maintained, that she never went more than a few days without human contact. The neighbors, shamed by their own negligence, also stepped up. They organized a meal train. They included her in block parties. They invited her to book clubs and coffee mornings. Mrs. Chin taught her to make dumplings. The Johnsons invited her to their granddaughter's ballet recital. Eleanor went from overlooked to cherished, and the change in her was remarkable. She smiled more, genuine smiles that reached her eyes. She laughed more, deep belly laughs that surprised her. She started wearing colors instead of the muted grays and browns she'd hidden in for years. A bright blue cardigan, a red scarf, a yellow dress she began wearing to church, which she'd started attending again. She got her hair cut and styled. She planted new flowers in her garden, working alongside Caleb and Ghost to clear the weeds. She started living instead of just existing. Started making plans beyond the next day. Started believing she had a future worth looking forward to. But beyond Eleanor's personal transformation, something deeper shifted in that town. People started questioning their assumptions about the bikers they'd feared for years. Started seeing past the leather and tattoos to the men and women underneath. People who understood loyalty and family in ways that put so-called respectable society to shame. The viral video sparked a national conversation about elder isolation, about how easily society discards people once they're no longer young or productive or convenient, about how many Eleanor Whitmores were out there, living quiet, desperate lives, about how the people we're taught to fear are sometimes the ones who show up when everyone else walks away. 6 months later, the club organized a birthday party for another forgotten senior they'd heard about through Eleanor, an 82-year-old widower named Harold who lived alone in a veteran's home and hadn't had a visitor in 3 years. Then another for a 70-year-old woman named Dorothy whose children had moved across the country and rarely called. Then another and another. It became an annual tradition, a ride called the Forgotten Birthdays Run, where members would identify isolated elderly people in their communities and make sure they got celebrated. They partnered with social services, with churches, with anyone who could help them find those who'd been overlooked. What started with Eleanor Whitmore and 43 bikers became a movement that spread across chapters nationwide, touching hundreds of lives, proving that brotherhood isn't about intimidation or reputation. It's about seeing those who've been forgotten and refusing to let them disappear. Eleanor lived 3 more years after that birthday. 3 years filled with more love, more connection, more joy than she'd experienced in the previous 67 combined. She became a fixture at club events, showing up to fundraisers and toy drives, always wearing her vest, always ready with a hug and encouragement. She became the club's unofficial grandmother. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep, Caleb's mother found her when Eleanor didn't answer her phone for their daily morning chat. It was exactly 3 years and 2 months after her 68th birthday party. She was wearing her vest even in bed. On her nightstand was a photo from the party, Eleanor surrounded by bikers, her face radiant. Over 200 bikers attended her funeral. They rode in formation from the church to the cemetery, their engines rumbling a final tribute. They stood in the rain as her casket was lowered into the ground beside her husband. She'd asked to be buried next to Richard, but wearing her vest, and more than a few of those hardened men wiped tears from their faces. At the reception afterward, held at the clubhouse, Caleb stood up to speak. His voice was rough with emotion, but his words were clear. Eleanor taught us something we needed to remember, that the smallest act of seeing someone, really seeing them, can change everything. That showing up matters. That nobody deserves to be forgotten. We wear patches that say brotherhood, but Eleanor showed us what that word really means. It's not about who rides beside you. It's about who you ride for, who you show up for when they need you most. He paused, looking around at the assembled faces, club members, neighbors, people from 3 states. She was our sister. She was our family, and we were better people for knowing her. The greatest gift she gave us wasn't gratitude for her party. It was showing us that we could be better than what the world expected us to be, that our loyalty could extend beyond our own ranks to change lives. The story of Eleanor Whitmore's 68th birthday party became legendary in biker circles, a reminder of what they stood for at their best. Chapters across the country told it to new members as part of their initiation. It became a touchstone, proof that their loyalty could be channeled toward kindness. But it also resonated far beyond that world, touching anyone who'd ever felt overlooked, forgotten, or alone. The video was shown in nursing homes and senior centers. Churches used it in sermons. Schools showed it to students learning about prejudice. It became a cultural moment that made millions of people reconsider how they saw both bikers and their own elderly neighbors. It proved that family isn't defined by blood or proximity or social standing. It's defined by who shows up, who sees you when others look past you, who celebrates you when the world has moved on, who refuses to let you disappear. Sometimes the people society teaches you to fear are the ones with the biggest hearts. Sometimes the outsiders understand belonging better than anyone who's always fit in. Sometimes brotherhood means showing up for a stranger because the right thing to do isn't always the convenient thing. Eleanor's story isn't really about bikers or birthdays or viral videos. It's about the fundamental human need to be seen, to matter, to know that your existence makes a difference to someone. It's about how one woman's quiet confession sparked a movement, how 43 motorcycles created a family, how the forgotten became unforgettable. It's about how sometimes all it takes is one person willing to listen, really listen, and then actually do something about what they hear. How that one act of attention can ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. How we're all one conversation away from changing someone's entire life. Because what Eleanor needed wasn't wealth or youth or a different past. She needed to know she mattered. She needed to be seen. She needed family. And family found her in the most unexpected form. 43 bikers who understood loneliness and refused to let another person suffer it alone. That's brotherhood. That's love. That's what it means to be human. What's your take on this? Comment below. I'm reading every single one. If this story resonated with you, hit the like and send it to someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more shocking videos like this, check out the previous videos on the channel.